Well, let's begin, please. Good afternoon. My name is Ron James, and I'm with the Center for Ethical Business Cultures. We are elated that you've taken time out of busy schedules to be here with us today to talk about the importance of financial integrity in the financial services industry. We've entitled our program From Fool's Gold to Financial Integrity, a look back at what's happened over the last 4 years as we experience one of the largest meltdowns in the financial services area. What lessons have we learned? How does it inform the kinds of choices that we'll make in the future? Your host today is the Center for Ethical Business Cultures in the Opus College of Business at the University of St. Thomas. We're a nonprofit, member-based organization that really works hard at helping business leaders as they build ethical and profitable business cultures. The center does that through a variety of means. It serves really at the intersection between thought and practice leadership. What does that mean? Those who are skilled or tasked with day in, day out, making sure that the world of work gets done, we view sometimes as practice leaders or practice experts. Those who focus on trying to understand direction through research and analysis, we really look to help us with sort of the theory behind the practice that we put together. The center serves at the intersection of those two. The University of St. Thomas prides itself in bringing together both theory as well as practice. Today we've structured a program that will help us do just that. We're fortunate to have joining with us Joe Nocera. I'll introduce him more fully in just a moment. He will help us understand from an expert's point of view what's been going on over the last 4 years. We have also fortunate to have with us a practice leader, Andrew Duff, who serves as a leader of his firm, and he'll give us a bird's eye view from the practice leader's standpoint. Finally, we have Peter Young, Dr. Young joining us, and he'll give us the academic's point of view. The program is designed to go for about an hour. We've left time at the end for questions and answers, engagement with you. We'll wrap up at 6, and then we've planned a reception in the atrium of this particular building. So you'll be going back down the hall, and we'll have a bit of time to interact with our guests for this evening. We'd also like to thank our sponsors for this evening who've contributed to making this program happen. They include at the silver level Piper Jaffray, and at the bronze level Bremer Banks and Adam Hansen and Associates. Please join me in saying thank you to them. Okay, the structure of our program is pretty straightforward. I'll introduce our keynote speaker. He will talk for a bit and give us his perspective. We will then invite the panelists to come up to the front. They'll join him at the table, and they'll provide a commentary of what's been going on through their lens. We'll start off with a conversation with the people at the table, but then start thinking of your questions. What insights did they trigger for you? Because we'll want to engage you in a conversation with them. Our keynote is Joe Nocera. Joe is an op-ed columnist for the New York Times. Before joining the opinion pages in April of 2011, he wrote the Talking Business column for the New York Times each Saturday and was a staff writer for the New York Times Magazine. Joe has been actively involved and kind of watching what's been going on during the financial services crisis. He actually co-authored a book with Bethany McLean in 2010, All the Devils Are Here, the history of the financial crisis. Before joining the Times, he spent 10 years at Fortune magazine and in a number of places, all looking at what's going on in the world of business from a number of lenses. Andrew Duff is the chairman and CEO of Piper Jaffray. He began leading that company in 2003 following the completion of the company's spinoff from U.S. Bancorp. He has also served as chairman of Piper Jaffray's broker-dealer subsidiary since 2003, and he joined Piper Jaffray in 1980. He currently serves on a number of boards, including the Securities Industry and Financial Markets Association, a national association for securities dealers. He's a member of the University of St. Thomas Board of Trustees and its Opus College of Business Strategic Board of Governors. He's also president of the Walker Arts Center Board of Trustees and an advisor to the Board of Directors at Great Clips. Dr. Peter Young holds the 3M Endowed Chair in International Business at the University of St. Thomas, Opus College of Business. He has written extensively on the subject of risk management and is recognized internationally for his work in both the public and private sectors. Prior to the chair he holds now, he held the E.W. Blanche Senior Chair in Risk Management in the Opus College of Business. He lectures and teaches around the world, both in Europe as well as in Japan, and he's been recently selected as an honorary fellow of the Institute of Risk Management in London. But to begin our conversation today, we're going to invite Joe Nocera up, and he'll help us put this into perspective, from fool's gold to financial integrity. Even though it's been 4 years since the collapse of Lehman Brothers, we still see similar headlines occurring. What's going on behind that? Have we lost trust and confidence in the public that the financial services industry serves, and how do we start to rebuild that, to regain that? Here to help us kick off our discussion again is Joe Nocera. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you. How does that sound? I'm very glad to be here. I always like coming to Minnesota, Minneapolis, St. Paul. One of the great things about your community is, unlike places like Cleveland and Boston, you have maintained a lot of headquarter companies here. And those headquarter companies have a tradition of caring about the communities and donating money to the communities and helping their communities that many other cities have lost. And this institute and this school, I think, is representative of that. So I'm going to sort of throw a few bombs here, so it's just the way I am. What does it mean to do the right thing in business? I want you to think about that. It is not an easy question to answer. People go to work every day and they think they're doing an ethical and moral job, and then one day they find out that everything they did led to a financial collapse. And they're being sued by the government. And people are angry at them. And people say that their industry is problematic and hurts society. And so what I really kind of want to think about today is this chasm between what individuals do inside a company and what the net result of those actions can mean for society. There are certain cases that are easy and they're almost not worth mentioning, but we'll mention them anyway. Madoff, the Peregrine scandal. Enron. Now, I was an editor at Fortune when Enron happened. And Bethany McLean, who co-wrote All the Devils Are Here With Me, wrote the first story about Enron's problems. It was called, very understated, it was called, Is Enron Overvalued? That's all it said. And it asked a really simple, dumb question, which was, how does Enron make its money? That was the whole story. Three or four page story. And she called up all these analysts who had buy recommendations on the stock. And she said, how do they make their money? Can you explain it to me? And they said, no, we can't explain it. It's a black box. But every quarter the profits are up, the revenues are up, and so we have a buy recommendation on it. Enron is an easy case because inside Enron there were a core group of executives who were committing fraud. Every quarter, Andy Fastow, who was the CFO, would take a certain amount of bad deals and Enron debt and shovel it off to banks that were enabling this fraud. And they would produce yet another wonderful quarter of profit. And as it later turned out, these side deals were approved by then the CEO, Jeff Skilling, and there were a small coterie of people inside Enron who helped make this happen. So you see a case like that, and then it turned out, WorldCom was a scandal, and Tyco was a scandal, and you had all these scandals in the late 90s, and they were black and white. Fraud was committed. People went to jail. There was no real question about what had happened here. And in the wake of that scandal, Congress passed a law, Sarbanes-Oxley. And the intention of Sarbanes-Oxley was to prevent anything like Enron from happening again. How did Bernie Madoff happen then? How did Peregrine happen again? Why did the law and the attempt not to make fraud, to create incentives that would diminish fraud, why didn't they work? One reason is because there are always going to be crooks. That's just a fact. Another reason, though, is that it's very rare that laws that are enacted to stop specific behavior really work. So in the case of Sarbanes-Oxley, it was fundamentally designed to force accountants, outside accounting firms and inside accountants, from being sure that the money is being managed properly, and at the same time, the CEO and the number 2 person, whoever that was in the company, would have to sign a document saying, we testify that our quarterly report or our annual report is accurate. There have been 0 criminal prosecutions in the wake of Sarbanes-Oxley. 0. And the rules have become a checkoff list for accounting firms that have no real meaning, but that add burden to corporations. So now we move, and those were the easy cases. So now let's move to the tougher cases. The financial crisis, it is often said, has seen no executive go to jail. And just the other day, actually, somebody, the SEC, the two men who ran the reserve fund, the money market fund that broke the buck because they held Lehman Brothers bonds and who were tried for deception, were basically found not guilty by a jury. And one of the reasons that there have been so few prosecutions, fewer than I think there should have been more attempts, but one of the reasons there have been so few prosecutions is because it's very hard to prove that the individual actions of people that collectively added up to this giant calamity were fraudulent. So let's just kind of parse this a little bit. So let's take Merrill Lynch, because they're a really good example of this. Their CEO was Stan O'Neill. He cared passionately about making his company the equal to Goldman Sachs. Every quarter, when Merrill's numbers came in and Goldman's numbers came in, he would have a fit, and he would tell his guys, "Why aren't you making as much money as Goldman Sachs?" Well, one of the reasons Merrill didn't take is because they didn't take as much risk. And one of the reasons they didn't take as much risk is because they had both veteran traders who had actually helped invent a lot of the mortgage products that the street was selling, and they had risk managers who were sophisticated about their understanding of the problems such products could entail. And the guy who ran that desk was a guy named Jeff Kronthal. And he was a veteran trader. And he was probably in his early 40s, which in Wall Street is old, 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 old. And Kronthal basically said, our job is to sell these products, our job is to sell these products, not to buy these products. And they would sell the products, and they had on their books about $5 billion worth of mortgage-backed products, CDOs, CDO squares, so on and so forth. One day, Stan O'Neill fired Jeff Kronthal because he wasn't taking enough risk, because he wasn't making enough money. And he brought in a man named Osmond Samerci from London, who had a reputation as a very, very aggressive trader. And by this time, it's 2007. And the mortgage market is starting to crumble. And Merrill can't sell these products anymore because nobody wants to buy them, even though they're rated AAA. The banks all have had their full of them. AIG has stopped backing them, which actually happened in 2005, believe it or not. So what does Samerci do? He buys them himself. They bundle and rebundle the CDOs into CDO squares. They put them on their own books. And they post it as profit. And when the crash comes a year later, Merrill has a $55 billion CDO exposure that they have to write down. And Stan O'Neill loses his job. And Osmond Samerci loses his job. And a lot of people lose their job. So let's think about this from a quote-unquote ethical perspective. Is Jeff Kronthal a more ethical human being than Osmond Samerci? Who knows? The only real difference is Jeff Kronthal was right and smart, and Osmond Samerci was dumb and wrong. That's the difference. And that's why Osmond Samerci is not in jail today. The entire the entire subprime bubble, with one exception, which I'll get to in a minute, is around those same set of issues. Goldman Sachs, at the height of the bubble, figures out that this is not going to go down well. So what do? They have a meeting in December of 2007. And they say, we got to go short this stuff. And they start selling all the junk on their balance sheet to their quote-unquote clients. And emails would come out later talking about the reputational hit that Goldman was taking with its own clients because it was shoving this junk down their throats. Citibank, you had Chuck Prince saying famously, the CEO, as long as the music's playing, we got to dance. Because Citi couldn't be in a position where it was making less money than JP Morgan, and its stock price is lower, and Chuck Prince would be out of a job. And it didn't matter that he knew, when you say a sentence like that the whole thing is going to end badly. It didn't matter. His incentives, all the incentives, were geared to this one thing, which is to keep up with Goldman, to have a return on investment of 20%, to have a high-flying, hard-charging stock price. And the only way you could do that in Wall Street in 2006, 2007 was by taking immense risk with really dangerous products. The rating agencies, slapping AAA on everything. Did they know that some of this stuff was bound to collapse? Probably, some of them did, probably. But the internal pressure and the internal incentives for S&P and Moody's, which are trying to turn their business into supercharged stocks, the incentive was completely on, let's figure out a way to make this AAA. Because if we don't make it AAA, S&P will do it. You know, you only needed two of the rating agencies, and you had three. It was a great deal if you were a banker, because you could just say, Well, we'll give the deal a Fitch. The one company, and this is actually the most tragic of all, where even though no one's going to jail, to me, out-and-out fraud took place, was Countrywide. And the reason it's a sad tale is because no company started, of all these companies, with a more noble mission. Angelo Mozillo had grown up poor and Italian, and he felt discriminated against, whether rightly or wrongly, and he wanted to give people like he was a chance to buy a home. That really was what Countrywide's original conception was. And for many, many years, they primarily dealt in prime mortgages. And their biggest customer was Fannie Mae, which bought 80 to 90% of their paper. And then competition came along. Subprime came along. Why did subprime rise? Well, one of the reasons it rose is because there was a way to get around Fannie Mae, and you didn't have to deal with them. And you didn't have to cut them in on your profits. And companies like AmeriQuest and New Century cropped up, and they started to steal market share from Countrywide. And Angelo Mozillo couldn't stand the idea of losing market share to his competitors. So as AmeriQuest began to write lousier and lousier mortgages to people who had no ability to pay them, Countrywide did the exact same thing. And the reason that I think that unlike these other cases, genuine fraud took place is because when you see what's going on now with all the litigation revolving around mortgage-backed securities and whether Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were sold securities that they were lied to about what was in the securities by the firm, and there's so much litigation going on around this, and there's been an incredible amount of investigation around mortgages and who the people really were who bought the mortgages and what their economic situation really was. And time again, you find these cases that are just completely outrageous, where, you know, a gas station attendant is listed on the mortgage as owning a chain of gas stations. And, you know, his salary is changed from, you know, $20,000 a year to $200,000 a year. It happened like crazy. And in that case, what really took place was a disintegration of a culture and a desire for market share that overwhelmed any ethical compass that had once existed inside the company. And the one person, very much like Jeff Kronthal got thrown out of Merrill, the one person, the former president of Countrywide, I think it's Stan Kurlak, his name escapes me at the moment, the same thing happened. He was the break. He was the one saying, this is going to end badly. And he was the one who had to leave. J.P. Morgan. Is J.P. Morgan more ethical than Citibank? Yet J.P. Morgan avoided all the trouble that hit Bank of America and Citibank afterwards. Is that because they're more ethical? Or is that because Jamie Dimon and his crew understood the products better and knew to sidestep them? So when I think about this set of behaviors, it's not ethics that I really think about. It's incentives. And the core issue is, how do you create incentives that will align employees and companies with the larger social goals that you're trying to create, which in the case of banking is you don't want them to blow up because it's federally insured. And it has both a societal role and a risk to the taxpayer that makes them different from other institutions. I mean, if Google went out of business tomorrow, a lot of people would be upset, but the world would not come to an end. If Citibank went out of business tomorrow, it would be a calamity for the world, not just the country. So they have a different position in society. So let's start with the regulatory incentives. One of the things, I always like to compare, we're going to get to Dodd-Frank in a minute, but I always like to compare Glass-Steagall to Dodd-Frank. Glass-Steagall, which passed in the 1930s, was the country's way at that time of trying to create proper incentives. And it did it in this, Dodd-Frank is what, 2,000 pages long? Glass-Steagall's 30 pages long. And it really only says one simple thing. You got to decide if you're going to be a bank or an investment bank. You can't be both. And if you're going to be a bank and be federally insured, you can't take trading risk. If you're going to be an investment bank and you want to take risk, we don't care. Do it. But you can't have federal deposit insurance and you can't take deposits because it's the taxpayer. That created a culture of banking that you could say, well, it was a sleepy culture. It wasn't a 20% return on investment culture. There's, the famous phrase 363. Take money in at 3%, lend it out at 6%, and be on the golf course by 3 p.m. That was the culture of banking for many, many years. And the incentive, there was no incentive for a bank to do anything differently. You really couldn't. If you were an investment bank, what was your incentive to not go out of business or to take excessive risk? You weren't a public company. The money that you were putting up was yours and your partners. So, when you thought about taking a big risk, you thought, this is my money I'm risking. This is not the shareholders' money. So you had twin incentives that were essentially aligned to make the financial services sector safe for 50 years. That's a really long time. And you can't really expect the regulation to do its job for more than that. It's an extraordinary thing that we went from the 30s to the 80s with very few problems in the financial sector. And then you get to the S&L crisis, and you get to the oil boom in the 80s, and you also get to really smart people who figure out how to find loopholes in Glass-Steagall. And suddenly there's a new incentive that's created. How do we get around this law? And once we start getting around it, we start trading, and we start taking more risk. And, oh, by the way, since there hasn't been a problem in the country for 50 years, nobody's worried. And then derivatives show up. There's a line in our book, it must be Bethany's because it's a really good line, where we found somebody who said, what Alan Greenspan always loved about derivatives was it was a virgin market, untouched by regulation. And his goal for the next X number of years was to keep it that way. And so what basically happened was that the regulatory incentives to act safely changed. And one of the things Greenspan always believed, and it's sort of incredible that he believed it, was that in a deregulated market, cream would rise to the top. And that, and I pulled this out from, Gary Becker and Richard Posner do a blog together, and they actually got into kind of an argument about this on their blog last month, where Becker, the economist from the University of Chicago, makes the Greenspan point. And the way he says it is, if repeat business is important for a company's profitabilities, and if customers are aware when they are cheated or are victims of other unethical behavior, competition tends to eliminate corrupt companies and promotes companies that behave honestly towards consumers. The reason is that corrupt companies will have little repeat business, and by assumption, that would crush their profit prospects. That's basically what Greenspan believed. And that's why he was a constant proponent of deregulation, and he even believed in a regulatory competition. He liked the fact that the OCC competed with the Office of Thrift Management for business. In other words, which one of them was going to get to regulate Countrywide, which one of them was going to get to regulate Washington Mutual. And the way they tried to get that business was by saying, oh, you know, Washington Mutual, if you come with us, we'll drop your capital requirements by 5 points. I'm exaggerating, but not by much. So that's the first set of misaligned incentives. The second set of misaligned incentives are the market incentives. And so, in terms of the market incentives, let me read Posner's response to Becker. The underlying assumption was always that markets work. They do work, but much the same way that biological evolution works. Biological evolution has produced a marvelous variety of life forms, and economic evolution has produced a marvelous variety of products and services that have greatly increased human well-being. But both types of evolution produce, quote, good results only as a byproduct to the struggle for survival. Unregulated, all they can achieve is fitness in the sense of adaptation to the environment. That may be good enough in most industries, but is not good enough for the overall health of the economy in banking. I can't think of a better paragraph that sums up what happened. The atmosphere was frenzied and bubbled. The market incentives were completely aligned in the short term. You were paid on the basis of how much you brought in that year, not over the long haul. You were encouraged to take more and more short-term risk. You were encouraged to make to rate lousier and lousier securities AAA. So everything just starts to get riskier and riskier and riskier and riskier because there's no market incentive that says don't do this. The market incentive says the opposite. If you want your stock price to go up, if you want to be competitive with the other firms, this is what you have to do. So everybody did it. And inside these firms, there was certainly trading behavior that was illegal, unethical, immoral. The LIBOR scandal is a perfect example of that. And even though the LIBOR scandal is something we've been talking about sort of now, that's only because it came out now. It actually took place in those years, 2007, 8, 9. So then there's the third kind of incentive, and this is the hardest because no government entity or outside entity can fix this. It has to come internally, and that's organizational incentives. And so, you know, your paycheck, how you get promoted and why, what is rewarded internally in the culture. Goldman Sachs, and I don't mean to pick on them, you know, their long time, you know, they have these 14, this creed of 14 things that they supposedly live by. And the first one is the client always comes first. But it's clear that in the years leading up to the bubble and beyond, the client did not come first. Now, Goldman would say, actually, we were always working on behalf of our clients. But what had happened was internally, the way they thought was, you're not a client, you're a counterparty, and that's different. And if you're a counterparty and you're stupid enough to accept the stuff that we're going to sell it to you. And so internally, everybody there thought they were doing the right thing. But when it came out years later, it really turned out that the whole culture had been corrupted by the rise of trading and the quest for profits in what had gone from a partnership to a for-profit corporation. At Merrill, the risk manager who had been aware basically got assigned to a broom closet on the 17th floor at a certain point. Was he ethically correct to stay in the broom closet, or should he have quit and tried to go to the regulators or tell people that the world was coming to an end? Those are hard questions. And the risk manager at Merrill, who was actually turned out to be one of the heroes of our book, stayed. And he didn't say a word. And he just sat and twirled his thumbs. And then one day, he sort of realized that things were going bad, and he pulled strings here and there to figure out what was going on, because nobody would tell him directly. And he went to Stan O'Neill, and he said, "You got a problem." And, I view that as a very courageous act and a very ethical act. And the upshot was, of course, Stan O'Neill did have a problem, and he wound up getting fired, and the risk manager that I wrote about wound up coming back and helping clean up the mess. So then the question becomes, what have we learned and where are we now? And so the main thing we're involved now is Dodd-Frank. That has been the government and the country's response to the excesses of the bubble. And if you ask me, will Dodd-Frank prevent another crisis, the answer is, I have no idea. There is absolutely no way of telling. The truth is, there are two things that are really problematic about Dodd-Frank from my point of view. The first is, that it doesn't change any incentives. It accepts the world as it is and tries to regulate every little piece of it. So unlike Glass-Steagall, and I'm not necessarily calling for a return of Glass-Steagall, but unlike Glass-Steagall, which was this very simple law that had the effect of changing incentives just by its very nature, Dodd-Frank doesn't do that. The reason you had the J.P. Morgan incident in London, the so-called London whale incident, was not because the London whale was unethical, but because the incentives hadn't changed. The person who ran that whole part of J.P. Morgan made $14 million a year. That's where the incentives are. With derivatives, they're talking about putting them on exchange and so on and so forth, but there's all these carve-outs and exceptions, and it doesn't seem like that's going to change much. The question of too big to fail, the government says that Dodd-Frank will ensure that there's never another bailout. But if Bank of America started to collapse, would the country, in fact, be willing to wind it down? Or would the government feel a need to save it as it did the last time? We don't know. What we do know is that the only reason all of these products like CDO squares don't exist is not because they've been outlawed, but because they blew up. And they caused a lot of harm, and a lot of people lost their jobs. And the truth is that if Wall Street, if we wait another 10 years and we don't change the incentives, you're going to have the same thing happen again. Because the economics are not different, the incentives are not different, even the pay structures are not different. The second risk that Dodd-Frank poses, it seems to me, is what I've come to think of as complexity risk. rules are so complex. 600 pages for derivative regulation, and the new Consumer Protection Bureau is putting out regulations that, even though I believe in the work that they're trying to do, is thousands of pages long. And big banks are hiring cadres of lawyers to sort through them. And they're so complex that the complexity itself creates risk. The regulators barely understand them themselves. The big banks, with all their smart lawyers, are going to figure out ways to maneuver them for profit's sake. And the addition of all this complexity raises the possibility that we could have another crisis that stems from things that we're not even thinking about right now. It's just too complicated. So, where I am now, 4 years after, Dodd-Frank came a couple of years after. We're now 4 years later. And we're kind of seeing that the landscape hasn't changed as much as one might think it would have. And we're wondering, some people are starting to raise this clarion call of, instead of regulating everything, single thing, let's go back at it and figure out a way to change incentives so that investment banks that want to take risk, we don't care if they go under. And banks that want to take risk, we don't allow it. You can't do it. My feeling is that we're not going to have another financial crisis anytime soon. But my feeling is that now is a time that we actually should go back in and relook at the law and relook at where we are and sort of think anew about how to protect the country in ways that make banks safe and that get people, employees, people acting in a more quote-unquote ethical manner, not because they're good people or bad people, but because that's where the incentives are sending them. So I will stop there. We've got 2 more speakers, and then we will have questions.
I'd like to invite Andrew and Peter, please, to join us at the front tables. Okay. Joe's given us some interesting things to think about. What's the role of ethics when it comes to creating culture? What role did ethics play, and how do people think about ethics in business? And then he links it to the incentive systems and looks at it from several levels. Both the sort of regulatory level, has the table been set appropriately for appropriate risk taking, the market level, or the right incentives in place, and finally the organizational level. Andrew, perhaps you could start us out by talking a little bit about it from your perspective, leading an organization. Share some insights with us, if you will, about how you think about what's transpired, please.
Thank you, Ron. Well, it's an honor to be with the panel today, and I'm very pleased to be with all of you this afternoon. I hope many of you know Piper Jaffray. We're a leading middle market investment bank. We're headquartered here in Minneapolis and have been in business for 117 years, which we're very proud of. I've actually spent my entire career at the firm and the last 12 years as CEO. The issues we're discussing today, I think, are critical to the industry and consequently very much so for our firm. And I would share that we think and talk about them a lot. What I thought I'd touch on today were 3 things briefly: the pressures we face as an industry, number 2, how we try and flag and resist those pressures as we serve our clients, and then lastly, how do you instill that right sense of ethics and integrity at our company? And one way I thought I'd do that is share a specific example of an issue we worked through. Let's start with the industry pressures we face. First amongst them, I would say, and Joe has touched on many of the things I'm going to speak to, is intense competition. Firms rise and fall quickly. There's apparently big opportunities and risks associated with them, but it's very, very competitive, a high degree of talent and resources. The pace of business is very quick. It changes extremely quickly. In fact, I would suggest, I think there's a sense of this, that the regulators, in fact, have a very hard time keeping up with it. These sophisticated, complex products that are not easily understood or easily regulated. There's very definitely a herd mentality. I think the Merrill Lynch example of that's very apt, where someone else that you compete with is performing at a better level, and whether it's thinking of your shareholders or thinking of your talent and how you compensate them, you have a sense that you've got to perform at that same level. I think very much the compensation dynamic, for better or for worse, and I think there's some of both, our industry is a meritocracy. It offers great opportunity that people that can come and perform can move up quickly, get significant responsibilities or access to significant firm resources, and then get compensated very substantially for that. And maybe the last one I'd mention is, I think, very much the move of our industry from partnerships to shareholders, and the big difference being other people's money, quote, end quote. You're really using their resources. The risk on the upside is a lot of compensation. The risk on the downside is somebody else loses their capital. That's very different than the legacy of the industry, which was one of partnerships where it was our capital. It's not a coincidence that most of these firms have people's names on them. The entire industry really was started with partnerships. So how do we think about that and keep an eye out for some of these pressures? There was a phrase coined of dangerous currents, and I think some of these are very real. Let me just mention a couple of them. The first would be goal mesmerization, really setting targets that are likely to be competitive ones, and you get singularly focused on, we got to meet that metric. Maybe it's that return on capital, ROE, and what's it going to take to get there. I think rationalization in accepting certain conduct creeps in. The two phrases that we have a close ear for are, quote, everybody does it, or we've always done it that way. Those are expressions, I think, that tell you you're in zones where it's okay and it's being rationalized. I think another dynamic is isolated teams of performers, and by that I mean people in a sort of discrete department, more so maybe a discrete compensation system with some autonomy, and very likely to start doing things that reward them well, maybe less oversight, less interaction with others, and over time I think that can take on some qualities where the risk-reward gets way out of line. Another principle, I believe, very much, and it's probably true of all of corporate America, but it's certainly true of capital markets firms like Piper Jaffray, which is problems never improve with age. When you have an issue, the market really, truly, it never bails you out. The problem never gets smaller. What it does is gets bigger. So the old adage that good news should travel fast, we say bad news should travel much faster. When you have a problem, you need a culture that says, I can go talk to somebody about it, and collectively we can think, what do we need to do about this? But to sort of hope it goes away is a recipe to make sure it gets larger and larger until it sort of explodes on you. Very importantly, open communication, that you really have an environment where people are encouraged to raise an issue. No shoot the messenger, a dialogue that routinely suggests we see an issue, we see a problem, let's talk about it. On the one hand, I don't admire that Goldman evolved to at their client's expense. On the other hand, I'd have to say it's impressive that in 2007, senior executives collectively were willing to look at a marketplace that no doubt was hugely profitable to them and say, you know what, this has signs of dysfunction, and we're willing to go against the current and think about how you manage through that. Most other organizations just go with the current, and when it's that profitable, moving that quickly, don't ask a lot of questions. So on the one hand, I recognize that a willingness to talk about an issue and challenge success is maybe what I'm suggesting. So what do you do to instill an environment that has a sense of ethics and integrity? I think it's certainly, you read this almost every time, it does start with the tone at the top. It's what I talk about as a CEO, other senior leaders, what we look for, not just the rules, but how we frame issues, how we talk about issues, the dialogue that we encourage. I think a second principle we feel very strongly about is no one person's bottom line is more important than the reputation of the firm. That old adage is very true. It can take decades and decades to build one, and it takes a very short time to erode one when you have a serious problem. Another issue we've thought significantly about, and then I'm working my way up to a case study that's actually taught here by Ken Goodpaster, who I see in the audience, is how do you keep ethics fresh? How do you talk about it in a way that really engages people and brings it to life and has them really think about it? And we've come up with a couple of thoughts there. One is case studies, taking the time to tell stories. And we do that in a variety of ways, including a series of brown bag lunches where we've had senior executives, predecessors of mine, come in and talk about things along the road in their career, problems, quote, mistakes, what's happened, and how they thought about them and what they learned. But if you're willing to really tell those stories, people do really listen. And that gets at another issue from our perspective, and I don't really have an answer to this, I would just observe it. It seems very hard to learn from other people's mistakes.
Will you use your microphone?
Oh, sure. Have you been, sorry about that? You heard anything I said? All right, well, I'm going to keep going. I'm not going to start over. All right, so how do you learn from other people's mistakes? And I would just share that we still work at that one. It seems very challenging when you look at some of the issues of 2008 and the meltdown and all the issues with mortgage-backed securities. There have been other chapters that have very similar characteristics. One was in the early 90s, 1993, 94, when interest rates changed very rapidly and mortgage-backed securities in particular dislocated. But you know what? If you weren't there and you weren't part of going through that mess, you probably didn't learn it. And along comes similar dynamics and it happens all over again. So that is a topic we continue to think about. How can we learn? So take the 2008 dynamic. We have tried to have some of those discussions and not to focus on other people's mistakes per se from a competitive perspective, but to say, hardworking, very competitive firms found themselves in really big messes. What can we learn from that? At the end of the day, it does all come down. It comes down to the people. It's a business of decisions and risk-taking, and do you hire people into your culture, into your values? Are you willing to recognize when they don't fit? And even when they're a high performer, are you willing to do something about it? I think at the end of the day. I thought I would wrap up with just sharing a brief sort of case study for our firm, and it goes back to the tech bubble. In 2003, this may ring a bell with you, Attorney General Eliot Spitzer brought a very large case with Wall Street around the conflict of interest between investment banking and research. At the core, research analysts being compensated for investment banking business, and could they really be objective? He brought that case and settled with 13 firms. Piper Jaffray was one of the 13. And we had a bit of a breakthrough, and were able to learn some things from that. I worked on it in particular with my general counsel, Jim Chosey, who's here today too, or as well. And we were working our way through the case and defending ourselves with Eliot Spitzer, and we realized one day that we were really focused on why us. Why are we one of the 13? We could name peers that had done just as much. We could name firms in the case that had been, enormously more egregious than us. And we were very focused on this isn't fair. Why are we being singled out? trying to push back, and then it just came to us one day that he was actually right. Forget his tactics, forget that we were one of the unlucky 13 at the end of the day, paying a research analyst out of the same bonus pool for the team bringing in the investment banking. How in the world could they be objective about those companies month in, quarter out, and be totally not influenced? And we shifted gears, and everything sort of changed for us when we realized, you know what, let's get to a reasonable settlement, but let's turn a corner and say, what did we do wrong, and what can we learn from this? And what we went on to do was to do a very thorough look at conflicts of interest inside our firm. Jim and I co-led the effort, and we had a team kind of go horizontally through the organization and do about 50, 60 interviews of people at all kinds of levels, and started with two questions for each of them. Who is your client? And got a variety of answers, but started with that. Who is your client, and what do they expect from you? And one of the things we realized is when we're conscious and see conflicts of interest, we actually manage them quite well. It's when we're not being thoughtful and really looking at it from that dimension, who is our client and what do they expect from us, that you actually end up in some conflicts that you don't manage. From there, we went and self-reported to the SEC. There had been an invitation from the Chief of Enforcement, a guy named Steve Cutler, to come do that. And that was a very rewarding experience as well. When we first got there and sat at a table like this with a panel of 12 across from us and started presenting it, there was moments when we felt like, did we really do this to ourselves? Are we going to get out of here? And in fact, it turned out, and maybe this is a thought towards future regulation, he was very sincere. He said, you know what, I can't keep up with your industry. I can't understand all of this, but if you'd actually come in and talk to me, maybe together, we can figure out a way to regulate where we're partners and you're all part of the solution. So that was something that ended up being very rewarding for us. Those are my thoughts.
Say thanks to Andrew. Peter, you've been studying these issues and researching them and advising on them. Please share your insights as well, too.
Thank you for inviting me, Ron. I really appreciate the opportunity. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm even getting feedback. My requirement, or the requirement that was made of me for tonight, was to talk about the idea of risk and its management. But if I can just briefly make a comment about the practice of risk management, there is a very, very interesting underlying story with what's been going on in corporate risk management. Beginning in the late 1990s, I think the demand for risk management began to outstrip our ability to understand what it was all about. And so quite apart from the struggles with being able to measure very, very complex risks, we've actually got a more philosophical but practical issue, which is what's risk management supposed to do in organizations. And I've been very fortunate recently to sit with a group of CROs and to talk about this, and the most consistent questions that they have about this is, what is it that I'm supposed to know? And what is it that I'm supposed to do? What's my value adding to an organization through my presence? What's my boss supposed to expect from me? And how do they measure that I'm being successful at what I do? So in addition to sort of the prosaic failures that we saw in risk management in financial institutions, I simply want to tell you that there's a much more profound question, which is, what's risk management supposed to be all about, and how are we supposed to determine whether we're doing a good job or not? Well, to my more organized comments, as I say, I've been asked to talk a little bit about the idea of risk and its management. The Italian author Roberto Calasso memorably wrote, "When life strips off its finery, what remains is fortune. Everything that happens is a constant collision of tossed dice." This quotation, I believe, casts a long shadow on the so-called science of risk management and its practice. Virtually nothing can be said to be a certainty in terms of time, place, and outcome. And thus, the logical starting point for thinking about risk and its management is a deep and abiding understanding of the overwhelming challenge and complexity of such an effort, and really the futility in believing we can completely predict and control the future. Colasso's observation, however, should not instill discouragement, merely humility. If we understand our limitations, we can begin to focus on those things that we can address. And, of course, the spirit of scientific inquiry always should motivate us to strive for understanding and mastery of risk. Now, a wider appreciation of humility vis-a-vis risk management, I believe, is the first of the two biggest changes in my academic field in the last 20 years. The second of these is the understanding of the importance of culture and human psychology in shaping our view of risk. I'd like to sort of talk about each of these for about a minute or two and then make kind of a summary comment. Regarding the first change, humility, risk management began as a loosely affiliated collection of technical functions, insurance buying, financial risk management, security, that sort of thing, but has evolved into a much more comprehensive and integrated approach, at least an attempt at an approach to managing the widest range of risks in organizations. The effort to expand the range and scope of risk management has quickly highlighted the futility in ever managing all risks, and this realization has had a profound early philosophical impact on my field, at least academically. Most notably for today, I would observe that the purpose of risk management, as we understand it right now, is seen as managing opportunities and threats in the way that best supports the overall strategy, goals, objectives, and mission of an organization. Yes, we want to manage bad things, and yes, we want to maximize good things, but a critical challenge is to create resilience and adaptability to respond to events as they unfold. It might not be overly gratuitous to say that resilience is not perhaps a key attribute of the financial community as we looked at it in 2008. Regarding the second change in my field, the interface between risk management and both anthropology, we might say, and behavioral psychology, well, this has led us to a realization, really to re-realize, that risk is a cultural and psychological construction, and thus the observer, us, intrudes on the methods of risk analysis and management, indeed intrudes on the risks themselves. Now, let me quickly add here that we have very powerful tools, and there were very powerful tools operating in Wall Street and in the financial services sector, and they provide very, very important insights on very, very complex risks. And to the extent that they help us improve the quality of our thinking and our decision-making, we should aspire to continue to use them. However, we humans have often forgotten that we're far from objective participants and observers of those risks. Our perceptions of risk are not objective, and our behavior under conditions of uncertainty exhibits some rather surprising results. We might even say irrational results. And thus it is very important that we include assessing and addressing what I call cognitive risks as part of the total challenge of managing risks in organizations. I hasten to add that ethical risks would be included in that broader category. Put slightly differently, most leading thinkers in my field recognize that an organization, or even a society's culture, and the psychological makeup of decision makers probably occupy a much bigger space in the risk environment than we believe to be the case, and consequently deserves a lot more of our time and attention than it has received to date. Let me illustrate this point with a brief story that has stuck in my mind over the years. The Deloitte Risk Consulting team in London, led by a close friend of mine, analyzed its work for Airbus a few years ago and came to the then surprising conclusion that implementing the technical stuff of risk management was really a breeze, relatively speaking. The consistently biggest challenge they had in this multi-year assignment was addressing the inconsistencies in the perception of risk across the organizational culture and vis-a-vis the dominant social cultures within that organization. And if they weren't spending time on that, they were spending time with the management team trying to understand how the individual perceptions of risk that were influenced by those managers' lifetime experiences, their psychological makeup and so on, was a big part of the risk management environment for Airbus. And sorting that out was the biggest risk management task that this consulting group took on. This led my friend to make the observation that 80% of risk management is getting ready to practice risk management. And what he meant by this simply was, if we do not understand the first order influence of an organization's culture and its values and the psychology of its management team, we will only, by sheer happenstance, design risk management programs and methodologies that work in the sense of helping managers make good decisions. Or perhaps to put it in today's context and today's subject, we might say that sophisticated risk management tools cannot change culture and values, and only in highly managed settings can they even change a manager's actual behavior. On this last point, in closing, I would strongly encourage anybody that's interested in this particular issue to read Daniel Kahneman's absolutely phenomenal book, Thinking Fast and Slow, to better understand how the human mind processes and responds to risk. In my view, there are few better frameworks for understanding the underlying risk management failures that led to our global financial crisis. Thank you.
Okay, we've built in time for some questions. Doug Jondal and Judy Olson are here, and they can grab microphones and respond to questions that you have. Just raise your hand and we'll be glad to respond to them. There's one right up front.
Thanks a lot. I enjoyed the comments. I'm struggling with some of the premises that you have, Joe, and one of the premises related to incentives, which I understand what you're trying to do. You've written a lot about the NCAA, and we all know coaches have certain incentives that can lead to bad behavior, and the NCAA is not necessarily the best people to legislate them.
Don't get me started.
But, you know, I go back to the old saying that temptation doesn't make us bad, it allows us to be good. And the problem that I'm having with all of these stories is that at some point, I'm not willing to give the free pass, I think, that we may give to people related to incentives. At some point, I think they're realizing they're doing the wrong thing at some level and continue to proceed. So Andrew's story I thought was really relevant, where they realized that this isn't working, but my suspicion is that the people who are actually doing the research and writing that stuff at some point realized that they were behaving in a way that wasn't the right thing. You'll never get aligned incentives completely appropriately. So what else?
But his investment bankers did not think while they were doing this, I don't think, that I'm doing something wrong. The incentive structure built inside of all the firms was that the analysts got paid based on how much investment banking he brought in, which is a direct conflict of interest. It wasn't until they sat down and they were facing the law in Spitzer, who was definitely a bully and who definitely overreached and so on and so forth, that the light bulb goes on and they say, you know, this behavior that we actually thought was fine, that we didn't think was immoral or unethical, really is problematic and we should change. So is it, you know, in 2000, before Spitzer showed up, you know, people who did this by and large didn't think, not always, but by and large didn't think they were doing the wrong thing. And I think that, most human behavior, much human behavior that goes on inside corporations, people think they're doing the right thing and the good thing. And it often requires an outside force to say, you know, this is not the way you should behave. The environment is that way. I mean, there's a whole raft of areas in life that are that way. I know that's an unsatisfactory answer to you, but it's different. Here's a distinction. If you worked for Andy Fastow, you knew that you were being asked to do something illegal. And the right thing to do was to walk away, or maybe even call the FBI. If you work for, I'm just trying to, I mean, you know, if you work for a company that is, you know, before the age of the environment came, that was, you know, polluting into the Hudson, and then one day there's an EPA, and one day there's heightened awareness, and people are saying this is behavior that needs to stop. And then you are in this ethical dilemma, which is, if you're a corporation and you're General Electric, do we say, yes, we were wrong, or do we fight, and do we get our backs up? And that's the moment, to me, where you're facing the ethical dilemma. I mean, that's the way I view it.
I just view the legal as the lowest bar, not the highest bar. So when the company's polluting, they might be aware that they're polluting, but it's still allowed to do that. I mean, at what level do they say this behavior is legal, but it's still not moral? It's not ethical.
I think part of where I hear you going is you can change the incentive structure, but unless you've got the ethics and integrity built into the system, you still won't get there. We're sort of addressing one of the symptoms as opposed to stepping back and looking at the underlying fundamentals. And I'm hearing you say it starts with ethics and integrity, if I'm tracking with where you're going. Andrew, did you have a comment on that as well?
Well, my perspective is largely Joe's, that just take my specific circumstance. We did think it was an acceptable business model. I was fully aware of it. I thought it was acceptable. And then upon scrutiny, which did come from the outside, you started to see it in a very different way. I would distinguish that, though, from behavior that included, you know, traffic amongst analysts saying one thing, strong buy, and internally saying to the trading desk, get out of that dog fast, okay? I don't think you need somebody from the outside to tell you that that doesn't fly. But there is a lot more in the gray where what seems like a reasonable business practice, when you're in it, when you get around it and look at it differently, it does have a conflict.
There's a question here.
The question has to do with Barney Frank. How could a person trained as a lawyer, should know right from wrong, how could he justify threatening bankers who didn't want to give mortgages to warm bodies?
Are you basically trying to say that Barney Frank was aligned with Fannie Mae?
I have some reservations about his ethics.
About his ethics? I can't help you there.
How many more people like that do we have that haven't been identified?
You know, Barney Frank is a staunch Democrat, and he supports Democratic causes, and he's a very political human being. But I don't think he's an unethical person. Sorry.
If he wasn't unethical, why was he accused of threatening lending agencies for not wanting to give mortgages to people who couldn't pay it back?
We need to move on.
Pardon?
I said we need to move on.
Let's come to the question here on this side.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Joe, for the fascinating talk. I'm a business ethics professor, and so I naturally tend to, if something bad happens, I tend to attribute it to bad ethics. You might say I have a vested interest in doing that, but I think you've convinced me. But what I think you haven't entirely convinced me of is your incentives story. And I remember sort of gravitating towards an incentives explanation when the crisis first broke, and then seeing studies come over my transom which suggested that banks that had more conservative compensation policies, such that their traders would not receive the full amount of their percentage, their cut of the deal, probably until 3 or 4 or 5 years after the fact. Those firms that had banks that had conservative policies were no less likely to get into trouble than those that didn't. And I wonder whether we're not overlooking, I guess Professor Young put it, a sort of cognitive story. And that's to say that this bears all the indicia of a classic bubble. And once you say bubble, then lots of things fall into place. So take, for example, the issue of the deterioration in underwriting standards. That becomes explicable if you see this in the light of it being a bubble, because if, as many of us expected, home prices are going to continue to rise, then who needs underwriting standards? And that becomes simply a regulatory hoop you have to jump through. No one is actually paying much attention to those standards.
Well, you're right, it was a bubble. And every element of society, government, business, and individuals were caught up in a bubble mentality. There's no question about that. But then the next question, what enabled the bubble? And it was not just that magically home prices were rising. It was that regulatory barriers that had prevented certain kinds of actions and individual barriers like, lying on liar loans, they disappeared. And so there was nobody to kind of stop the madness. I mentioned Goldman Sachs, turning in 2007. One of the reasons they did was because they were the best risk managers in the world. They're the best risk managers in the world. And they're the one firm where the CFO is also the lead risk manager, and so he has actual power. JP Morgan, the reason they avoided the problems was because they had essentially invented most of these products and they understood how dangerous they were. But just because there's a bubble doesn't mean that things fell away. I mean, every CEO, never mind the traders, every CEO was being paid based on the profits that the firms were making. The incentives went, all the way down. So Stan O'Neill was getting $60 or $70 million because Merrill Lynch was making so much. If they made less, he would get less. And so I think, and let me just say something, and I don't want to hurt your feelings, but Wall Street, this is going to sound terrible, and I don't mean it to, but Wall Street is uniquely compensation driven. And people who go to Wall Street, as opposed to going to Procter & Gamble, are people who want to make a lot of money. And so if you create incentive, the truth of the matter is the old relationship investment banking and having one client for 30 years and coddling that client and taking care of it the way Felix Rohatyn used to do back in the day, that's gone. That's all gone. It's all about trading. It's all about maximizing short-term profits. High-frequency trading, they're moving in nanoseconds. So, ultimately I think that in the 80s and 90s, the incentives began to change in dramatic ways so that by the time you got to 2004, everything was in place to allow this bubble to happen. And that's kind of how I think about it. I don't disagree that there was a bubble, but I do believe that the bubble was enabled by either changed incentives or lack of incentive.
And if I could I just add a thought on that? Think of incentives, I think this is a related dynamic, also from an ownership perspective, so it goes back in part to my comment about partnerships. I think when you're a partnership and it's your capital, you tended to think much more long-term. You thought about long-term relationships. And there's a way you can see that in the housing bubble too, which was securitizations. Part of the reason that devolved to where it did is there were a whole bunch of people in the chain who touched that mortgage for about a minute and a half and then got paid, and then it moved through the chain, and ultimately it ended up in some crazy security sold to the guy in Iceland, as the famous story goes, who really didn't know better. Contrast that with Canada. they put their mortgages on their balance sheet. So you make a mortgage, you own the mortgage until the house is paid off. And guess what? Canada did not go through the bubble and the burst. So I think that's a related dynamic.
There's a question in the back here, please.
Thank you all for your comments. My question is set in the context of risk management, culture, resilience, and process. It's one thing when the catalyst for an epiphany comes from Eliot Spitzer. My question then is, what cultural attributes or risk management practices create a process wherein an internal catalyst provokes the same sense of urgency or greater sense of urgency than an external catalyst?
Well, in my very opening comment, I alluded to the fact that we're trying to understand that right now. I mean, I think the fact is that very few chief risk officers in financial institutions, with a few notable exceptions, really have the levers in their hands to be able to influence up and down and sideways. There is a phrase that's emerged from a research standpoint in my field called risk leadership, which is really all about not the technical side of it, but how is risk perceived within the boardroom, within the executive suite, and how is a better sensibility and understanding of risk incorporated into the day-to-day kind of thinking and decision-making that managers make. And you would very reasonably ask the question, well, who's teaching these people that? And it's supposed to be these chief risk officers. But here we've got, I think, a really elegant example of this sort of problem and disconnection between, well, people should behave a certain way, they should behave properly, and what are the incentives that align? Because you can, as a government regulator, for example, create incentives that align with broad public policy objectives, but you can't get inside of a manager's brain and understand what their ethical values are, and they're going to respond to whatever kinds of regulations you put. But to get back to the point, we don't know honestly what the chief risk officer is supposed to do when they're hired by a financial institution because they have to be, because Sarbanes-Oxley, there's some implication there, or in other regulations that they're supposed to have a chief risk officer, and there's not really a culture to support and value risk management, in part because we don't understand exactly what it is. It sounds like a mealy-mouthed academic sort of response, but honestly, this is one of the strangest artifacts of my field right now, is that the demand for it, the requirement for it, has moved faster than both the academic and practitioner world's ability to understand exactly what the goals and purposes and objectives are, and how risk management is an articulation of an organization's values and its ethics. We made an early attempt here at St. Thomas to write a paper about ethical risks in their management, but I will tell you plainly that it's very, very early days. But unless we can solve that, unless we can sort of get risk management and risk awareness and risk leadership kind of instilled as a value of the organization, everything's just kind of a circus sideshow, because you can do all the risk registries and all of the kinds of modeling that you want, but if top management and everybody doesn't believe it's important, doesn't believe it resonates with how they value their organization and how they value the work that they do, nobody's going to take it seriously. And that's where it's just sort of that artificial world right now where a lot is being done, but it really hasn't become a part of the culture of organizations.
And with that, we are going to have to hit the pause. I see there are a few more hands, but we want to stay true to the time commitment. We will have a reception immediately following, so we'd like to invite you to please share your questions at the reception. Our panelists have agreed to join us for that. They've given us some very interesting things to think about. Is it the structure of the industry? What's the role of regulation or government? What's the role of leaders and organizations? And what's the dynamic going on in the marketplace? And how does a leader navigate that? How do you start to link these concepts of ethical leadership and ethical culture with risk management and regulatory oversight? And what's the relationship, the partnership that needs to exist between these key stakeholders, presumably here business as well as government, as well as those that they are serving. How does this come together? I think they've raised more questions for us than we have time for answers tonight, but we will continue this dialogue. Please join me in saying thank you. I would like to thank you all for coming tonight. Again, we do have a reception planned. Please plan on stopping down and continuing the conversation. Thanks so much.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you as well. This is really fun.
And yours too.
Thank you, sir, and yours too.
Thank you.